So Resident Evil Village is a thing. There have been 8 of these games. Actually, there's been a lot more than that, not including the remakes. If you watch my channel, you might know that I have a rather complicated relationship with horror. I'm consistently fascinated by the premises and stories, but way too scared to sit down and watch the execution. That goes for games and movies. I've never tried reading horror because that sounds like actual torture. But of course, it's Spooktober, and every year I try to get over my fear and talk about horror. In spite of being a chicken shit, I actually really like the Resident Evil franchise quite a bit. I sort of fell into this one. My brother and I are both fans of Dino Crisis, and if you don't know what that is, I have a video on it. But because of those games, my brother started playing Resident Evil 1 and then 2. I wasn't even remotely interested in them at the time because they were super scary, which is hard to believe when you look back on the graphics of those games. But in 2005, Resident Evil 4 came out and I began to take notice. Not because I wanted to play it, but because people wouldn't shut up about how good that game is. And they still won't shut up about it. But when my brother brought home a copy of the game, I watched him play it. I think this might have been the first time I watched him play a horror game, and while I hated how scary the zombies were, I was invested in the story. And then I watched my brother play the remake of the first game, and I guess that was it for me. Don't get me wrong, I've never played a single Resident Evil game, but I can't wait for another game to come out. I'm still too scared to play, but happy to watch someone else get scared. Actually, I have a whole video on how Let's Plays in horror work. Resident Evil has gone through several transformations, but despite the ups and downs the franchise has been through, it's possibly the most recognizably and arguably the biggest name in survival horror. It's right up there with Silent Hill in the way that it redefined how horror in gaming works, and it carried on the legacy of games like Clock Tower. Now, with the most recent releases of Resident Evil 4 Remake and Resident Evil Village, the series has somehow managed to maintain its status as both a series dedicated to campy horror and genuine terror. And while I love the camp of Resident Evil 4 and its remake, despite the differences, it was Resident Evil 8 that caught my attention in regards to how video games just hit different when it comes to horror. There are a lot of games in this franchise, and some that are scary, but I'm going to focus on Resident Evil 8 for the sake of clarity and ease. The horror in this game stems from how pacing, atmosphere, and most importantly, game design can be used to affect the player. Video games are unique in that they are an interactive form of narrative storytelling, and this game proves that if done well, they can make a player experience fear in a way that movies can't even come close to. And so today, I want to talk about Resident Evil 8. Back in the early 90s, Tokuro Fujiwara of Capcom wanted to create a sequel to a game he had worked on for the SNES called Sweet Home. The problem was that Sweet Home was a game based off of a movie, meaning that licensing would be an issue. Instead, Fujiwara teamed up with Shinji Mikami and a few others to develop and improve upon the ideas from Sweet Home, but under a new title. This game went through a lot of iterations as the team played with what kind of camera, playstyle, and even what system they would release it for. Eventually, they settled on a third person with fixed camera angles, and the game was released for the PlayStation in 1996 under the name Resident Evil, although in Japan it's called Biohazard. The 3-year development, which was a long time by the standards of the day, paid off because the game was highly praised. In particular, the atmosphere was lauded for being tense and visceral, and the fixed camera angles were a particular favorite of fans and critics who drew comparisons to German expressionist films, which had influenced horror films for generations. The only nitpick was the game's laughable dialogue and voice acting.
Stop it! Don't open that door!
But neither of these things deterred fans who loved the maze-like level design and scary monsters. Some of them actually seemed to like the campy qualities, comparing the game to schlocky horror movies. The game was a huge success and is considered a defining release in the video game world. It is arguably the reason zombies returned to pop culture, and while games like Clock Tower, which had similar gameplay elements, predated Resident Evil, the game is considered the originator of the survival horror video game genre. With such critical and commercial success, Capcom quickly set about making a sequel and released Resident Evil 2 in 1998 and Resident Evil 3 in 1999. Both sequels were also highly lauded. It would seem that Resident Evil was so good that it wouldn't stay a trilogy for long, and the next mainline title was released in 2005, but the wait was worth it. Often considered one of the greatest games of all time, Resident Evil 4 shook the video game world both critically and commercially. It redefined the shooter genre in a way that hadn't been done since Doom. While the game was intense, some fans felt it was missing the horror elements, a sentiment that would continue to plague the series with Resident Evil 5 in 2009, which many said felt more like an all-out action game and was missing both camp and horror. In 2012, the franchise hit its lowest point yet with Resident Evil 6. The game was not well received, and while not a bad game per se, it did feel disjointed and lazy. It appeared that Capcom was in a dilemma. They wanted to bring back the horror, so they really listened to fans and spent some time trying to figure out where the roots of this game really lie. And in 2017, they released the amazing Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. For the first time, a mainline Resident Evil game was in first person, and the scope and level design were kept very small in order to really hone that atmosphere and tone. Capcom kept this goodwill up by revealing that Resident Evil 2 and 3 were both going to be remade in spectacular fashion. And finally, this was followed by Resident Evil Village in 2021 and Resident Evil 4 Remake in 2023. Resident Evil's story is as sprawling as the games themselves. I'm going to touch on a bit of backstory for the whole franchise, but I'm mainly focusing on 7, 8, and the DLC for 8. So if you don't want to hear any of that, then this is your spoiler warning. In Raccoon City, the Umbrella Corporation has been secretly testing bioweapons because government, capitalism, I don't know, take your pick, really. One of these weapons happens to be some kind of mutated Ebola virus, which causes people to become these shambling, regenerating creatures bent on eating flesh. In immediate response, a special team called STARS is sent to the Spencer Manor, where the outbreak is centered. Here, Jill Valentine and Chris Redfield are separated from each other and their squads as they roam the old manor, uncovering the secrets of the Spencer family and its ties to the Umbrella Corporation. Resident Evil 2 takes place a few days later in Raccoon City. On her way to find her brother, Claire Redfield encounters rookie police officer Leon Kennedy. Both are terrorized by a hulking monster with a strange fashion sense called Mr. X. Resident Evil 3 saw the return of Jill Valentine in Raccoon City, where she attempts to escape a creature called Nemesis with the help of Carlos. Resident Evil 4 brought Leon to a remote European village in order to save the president's daughter, Ashley, from a group of crazy cultists infected with something called Las Plagas. Resident Evil 5 and 6 both happened. Resident Evil 7, or Biohazard, introduced Ethan Winters, who after 2 years finally has information about his missing wife Mia. He follows the clues to an old house in the swamplands of Louisiana, where he encounters the deranged and monstrous Baker family, which now seems to include Mia. It turns out that Mia was working for a top-secret organization who put her in charge of a bioweapon. Unfortunately, the tanker ship carrying that weapon crashed and the weapon escaped. The weapon turns out to be a young girl named Evelyn who is able to control a kind of mold that infects people. Once freed, Evelyn was able to wreak havoc unchecked and infected Mia and the Baker family, turning them into these monstrous versions of themselves. Ethan manages to escape with Mia and is rescued by none other than Chris Redfield, working for Umbrella. In the 8th game, Resident Evil Village, Mia and Ethan have relocated to a small house in Europe to find peace with their newborn child, Rose. Except they're attacked by Umbrella and Mia is killed. Ethan is furious with Chris, who told him that his family would be safe. Lost in this remote village, Ethan finds that the local religious woman, Mother Miranda, has tasked 4 local lords with protecting pieces of Ethan's daughter Rose until she's ready to use the baby's body to resurrect her own daughter. Ethan defeats the lords one by one, starting with the vampire lady Alcina Dimitrescu, the living doll Donna Beneviento, the fish monster Salvatore Moreau, and the mechanist Karl Heisenberg. The lords and the townsfolk have all been infected with a parasite called a Cadu, which in combination with a fungal growth transforms people into monsters. Miranda plans to do the same to Rose in an attempt to bring her daughter back. This mold-like substance found underneath the village is also capable of retaining memories, meaning that Miranda's daughter's consciousness is still inside it, and Rose, having been carried by Mia, who was infected by Evelyn's mold, would be the perfect candidate. Ethan doesn't want this to happen for obvious reasons, and fights back, even meeting up with Chris, who informs him that he had to kill Mia because it was actually Mother Miranda in disguise as Mia. And after defeating Mother Miranda, Ethan saves Rose, but realizes he's been infected since his encounter with Evelyn, and he dies. The Shadow of Rose DLC takes place many years later. Rose is now 16 years old and in the care of the Umbrella Corporation and her handler, Chris Redfield. Wanting to get rid of the weird infection that has made her miserable, she is tricked into finding a piece of the mold from Europe and letting her mind enter it. And then things go all Kingdom Hearts as she delves into the depths of this weird shared consciousness.
I've been having these weird thoughts lately. Like, is any of this for real? Or not?
Here she must face off against what is left of Evelyn, Mother Miranda, and even her own demons. Horror and camp have often been tied together, and Resident Evil 8 in particular does a great job of walking that line. After the success of 7, it appeared that Capcom wanted to inject a bit of that Resident Evil 4 back into the story.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
The story is basically the same structure as 7. You show up to a new place looking for someone, then you're introduced to the antagonists in a cutscene and proceed to make your way through their respective areas while offing them one by one until you deal with the primary villain. The difference in Village is that the 4 lords are a bit less terrifying and a bit, well, campier. The only one of them that is really terrifying in the horror sense is Donna Beneviento, but at the beginning she is the least interesting, next to the charismatic Heisenberg and the pathetic misshapen Moreau, and of course the towering Dumitrescu. Seriously, Capcom knew exactly what they were doing when they designed her.
I'm not bad. I'm just drawn that way.
But compared to the others, Donna is kinda lackluster. But I think this works in her favor, and if you played the game, I think you know exactly what I'm talking about. After defeating Dumitrescu, Ethan heads to the manor of the Beneviento family. And because we've spent most of our time dealing with the impressive Lady Dumitrescu, and to a lesser extent Heisenberg, Donna is basically an unknown. Up to this point, the game has had some tense chases and fights, and the setting has been gothic, but it isn't until you enter the House Beneviento that things take a noticeable turn towards the downright horrifying. And this is because of how game designers handle atmosphere. Atmosphere is a bit hard to pin down. Scholars have a hard time explaining why some instances of atmosphere work well while others fail. But as an oversimplification of this problem, I posit that it is the combination of setting, sound, music, mystery, and the uncanny that makes atmosphere work well. And House Beneviento has all of this down to a science. For starters, compared to the village and castle that Ethan has explored thus far, the dollhouse is relatively small. I don't just mean the map, which is much less expansive, but the actual spaces themselves are more cramped. Hallways especially feel like they squeeze you along to the next room with their stark and uninviting walls. Compared to the lavish wood and stone halls of Castle Dumitrescu, this is downright claustrophobic. Combat in the dollhouse would have been brutal, not just because you don't have your weapons, but because everything is enclosed. Even in larger rooms, your pathways are limited around tables or chairs. But in contrast to the hallways, the rooms are often lavishly detailed with lots of knickknacks and hidey holes. This is deliberate because when something changes in one of those rooms, you're much more likely to notice. The rooms also seem larger because the corners are hard to see. Lighting in a horror game is crucial. We all know that darkness is scary because of what might be lurking in it, but too much darkness means your player can't see their objective. Without the light, you can't show anything, including the sights that are used to build anxiety. Imagine how ineffective jump scares would be if you couldn't see the face. Getting the lighting just right in a horror game is a constant act of balance. You need to keep things as dark as possible so the player feels that anything could be just out of sight, but too little light makes the game impossible to complete. It's worth noting that visuals are not really where the bulk of horror is done. Humans are visual-centric, which means we rely heavily on our eyes for visual information. This is why lighting is important, but our second most sensitive sense is sound, and we're actually incredibly good at discerning a lot of things through sound, but not as good as we are with sight. Proximal distance, relative location, room size, and even types of objects are all information we can glean just from hearing. It's just that we usually turn our head to confirm what we hear with our eyes. If you force a player into a situation where they can't do that, you can play on their sense of space and location. So by limiting us to our second best sense, we already create a sense of unease. How a character's footsteps sound on a floor and the way their breath punctuates the air, how their voice echoes in a room, all of these convey little bits of information about space. And then you start to mess things up by adding sounds without any apparent sources. Footsteps from nowhere. Children laughing. Personally, I hate that one, but it works exceedingly well. You can hear her, and she sounds super close, but there's no way to see her. It gives the feeling that she has all the power watching you, and you're like a rat in a maze. Of course, music can help with this too. Without going into too much theoretical detail, in traditional Western harmony, there are certain note combinations that put people on edge. When these are played without any discernible rhythmic pattern, or sometimes just left to build in intensity, it can be really uncomfortable. But this is most effective when it's contrasted with silence. A good horror game knows the right moments to make its music ramp up in intensity, but a great horror game shows its mastery of atmosphere by knowing when to employ silence. The last two ingredients in atmosphere are mystery and the uncanny, or unheimlich for all my Europeans out there. Part of what makes atmosphere work so well is that environmental storytelling is employed. The dollhouse in Resident Evil Village has this as well, but I think it actually works better in the DLC. We have already gleaned some information about Rose feeling alone and left out, but instead of being told this outright, we've only really inferred it. Once she reaches the dollhouse, we start to get this story of a young girl being bullied. Now, is this Rose's story, or maybe it's Evelyn's history? Perhaps it's both and they have more in common than they think, but that's not really the point. The story is far spookier when it's left up to interpretation and told through the puzzles. Once again, it feels like the player is left helpless as the dollhouse is all-knowing and taunting. The player has to be made to feel somewhat helpless, or at least in a position of less power. That is what it means to be vulnerable, after all. And if you have information, you can arm yourself with that knowledge. And we all know that seeing the monster is what stops it from being scary. So mystery is employed. Sort of. Sometimes seeing the monster can actually be done effectively if the build-up is done well. And this can play on the last element of atmosphere, the uncanny. This is the hardest one to explain, but it's that feeling that things are not as they should be. This is why sounds with no sources or moving furniture are creepy. It's possible that a breeze moved things, but it just doesn't feel right. This can be employed really well for a monster too, because it can bring the sense of unease. Look at the way the horrible baby monster lumbers around, but it makes these sort of like horrible cooing and crying sounds. Oh, it's just awful. It's the perfect kind of disjunctive, uncanny usage of revealing a monster in a climax. It's hard to pin down exactly what horror atmosphere is, or any kind of atmosphere for that matter. You kind of just know it when you feel it, because it's not something you can really explain. Explaining it might actually ruin why it's working. It takes away that sense of mystery. A big part of making sure atmosphere works is knowing when to employ different parts of its makeup, or knowing when not to use them at all. Players can only take so much intensity before they either become overwhelmed by it or desensitized to it. In either case, it means that it becomes harder to scare them effectively, especially in the former case because they're likely to just turn the game off. This is why it is essential for game designers to understand pacing. Recently, there's been a shift towards more open world games, and this is awesome, don't get me wrong. I have a whole video on Breath of the Wild and why that game's open world is spectacular, and I get to say the word weenies a lot, so it's great. Check that out. What is neat about open world games is that if done right, you essentially let the player pick their own pace. So you can dick around and explore, or engage in some side quests or mini games, or you can choose to further the storyline and feel that intensity. For games like Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom, which are sprawling epic fantasies that emphasize exploration, this works really well. But for a horror game, open worlds are tricky. I'm not saying you couldn't do it, certainly people have tried. Choo Choo Charles is a great example of an indie developer making a great attempt at this, but you can already notice some differences. The atmosphere and tone in Choo Choo Charles are wicked, and Charles can come at any time, which makes the game really tense. However, I wouldn't say that the game is the same kind of horror. That's because horror stories rely heavily on being able to introduce new elements, and this needs to be done at exactly the right time. Resident Evil Village does have some open world segments. You can roam the village pretty freely, and with every lord you beat, you open up more space to freely move about in, except for the dollhouse. Once you enter the dollhouse, Donna steals your weapons and you get locked into her little game. This means for the duration of this part of the game, you're heavily railroaded. And while you, the player, might be frustrated, it is imperative that this happens. Because if you could just leave and go fishing for a few minutes, all of that carefully crafted atmosphere would go to waste. You'd come back to the dollhouse and the spookiness would be lost on you. Atmosphere is something that needs to be built up. You have to experience it, be steeped in it. Otherwise, a moving object might seem more like a glitch in the game than actually scary. By locking the player into the dollhouse, the tension can be controlled. Of course, you know something scary is going to happen, but the pacing dictates events in a careful order, doling out these little moments that are uncanny enough to put the player on edge. And then maybe a few little scares will occur to freak the player out.
Nothing seems to be threatening me.
Oh, fucking!
It's at this point that Resident Evil gives you a challenge, some kind of puzzle to solve. Games are, after all, an interactive narrative, so this gives the player a clear goal to work towards, but it also forces the player to pay attention to their surroundings in order to find pieces of the puzzle. These pieces are usually sequential, meaning that one piece leads to the next piece, so even the puzzle can be paced out. And while you're bumbling about trying to find pieces in a distracted state, the game can build more tension and throw scares at specific moments. Of course, the game can't do this forever. Eventually, something truly scary occurs, and you're forced to either run or hide or fight. The waiting is over and the climax brings tension to an all-time high. And after this, there is relief. You don't immediately go back to another set of scares. Otherwise, the scares would be less effective. I think that the dollhouse in Resident Evil Village is actually scarier because the rest of the game is campy. The pacing is ramped up in intensity, and then there's relief after defeating Dimitrescu, but instead of being met with another menacing or more powerful lord with cheesy lines, you contend with this tiny little house and a building sense of horror, wondering what's around the next corner. The game has deliberately paced out when you enter the Beneviento Manor and exactly how and when you will walk through it, all in the name of creating the best scares. In a movie, the threat of violence is really only felt if the audience has created a parasocial interaction with the on-screen characters, but in a video game, the threat is more personal. I talked about this in the aforementioned video on Let's Plays, and obviously there's no real threat of violence, but the tension and action are all based on inputs from the player. That means if you want to know what's going to happen next, you're forced to push the button that makes your character move forward. You can sit and watch all day, but until you push that button and walk forward, nothing will happen. As a game designer, you're in a kind of roundabout way forcing the player to become a participant in their own experience of fear. They know they will be scared if they play, but to beat the game, you still need to move through it. They either want to be scared because they're freaks of nature, or they want to know what will happen next, but either way, they must be a consenting, active participant to the torture. I mean horror. And because we want the game to be challenging, the interactions are more than just moving through a scary space. This is a video game, not your local haunted house attraction. You can't just close your eyes and get through the dollhouse, you have to solve its puzzles. But how do we make sure a mechanic isn't distracting from the horror instead of enhancing it? This is a good question, and one that I think a lot of horror games struggle with. Puzzles are effective for the reasons I mentioned, but it's actually the Shadow of Rose DLC that I think does the best job I've seen in a long time, by combining a specific game design mechanic with the horror elements. Before I mentioned the uncanniness of a monster and how that makes a really effective climax in Resident Evil Village. We definitely want to escape that awful fetus monster, but Shadow of Rose has a way smarter set piece with its mannequins because you're not just forced to run away from them. For starters, Evelyn refers to them as mommy. Mannequins are already really unsettling in how much they look like a human but are stripped of basic human features. But these mannequins are given a few features to make them look just enough like Mia, who is Rose's mother, which is a really fucked up taunt on Evelyn's part, not to mention the glowy eyes, which are not fun in the dark. So we're right on point for story, uncanniness, and creep factor. But once you start in on their game mechanic, that's when they really get you. They're jerky and deceptively quick. The good thing is, they only move when you aren't looking at them. Weeping angel ass motherfuckers. This plays with the age-old idea that when you see a monster, it isn't scary anymore. And that is true for the Mia mannequins, or Mianikins. The only issue is that you also have to interact with the world around you. This means that at any given moment, you're forced to look away at either whatever task needs doing or at the other mannequins chasing you. What's more is that there are parts of this level where you need to move them in order to get them out of your way. So you look away so that they'll move, but they're getting closer to you. You just have no idea how close they are. You have control, but it's limited, and not knowing can be nail-biting. But apart from being a really excellent set piece, this mechanic is also introduced and executed perfectly. According to video game scholar Mark Brown of Game Maker's Toolkit, mechanics can be successfully implemented in 4 steps. He uses platformers to outline this in his video, but the principle is the same. First, the mechanic must be introduced in a place that it is safe to learn. The first time we see the mannequin, we have enough space to watch it from the other side of the room. It isn't until we start to move into the next room that we lose sight of it and we hear its footsteps. But so far, we're safe enough to figure out how it's going to work. The next step in introducing a mechanic is development, where the player must apply what they have learned safely to an unsafe environment. When Rose reaches the kitchen, we need to lure the mannequin into this room in order to get around it later, but also so it doesn't catch up with her, so we're already forced to look away in order to lure it into the room. We, the player, are under pressure to show our understanding of the mechanic. Once we grab the fuse box to make the elevator work, we exit the room only to come across the third step of introducing a mechanic, the twist. And in this case, we discover now there is a second mannequin that is directly opposite the direction of the other mannequin, forcing quick action. The last step is mastery, where the player must show their understanding of the mechanic at high levels. In Shadow of Rose, this is done by forcing the player to contend not with 1, but 2 more mannequins for a total of 4, and they must all be juked in order to make it out of the final room back to the elevator. This is textbook, and yet the way the steps are presented in quick succession in order to ramp up the tension in the form of difficulty and the tension in the form of horror is excellent. The fact that the entire segment happens in narrow hallways with tight corners means sightlines are easily lost. The sound design is perfect because you dread it, but you need to hear those footsteps so you have some idea where the mannequins are when you can't see them. Not to mention Evelyn's laughter, which is creepy and omnipresent. The build up to this section has been puzzles, and after this section, Rose does some stealth-oriented stuff, but this mannequin thing was so clever and novel that it really got to the heart of how mechanics, atmosphere, and pacing work together. You could even think about this 4-step mechanic system as pacing on a micro scale, but this short little section really highlights how games excel at horror when the aspects of the art form are utilized well. Horror is a tricky concept to get right. There's tons of scholarship on just movies and television, and the jury's still out on how things like atmosphere even work or what they even are. And while horror in literature has been around for forever, video games are a very new medium. But they seem to be exceptional for horror because of the way they affect the player directly. The player becomes a willing part of the game and has to interact directly with the horror. This means things like atmosphere, pacing, and game design, if used effectively, can create a horror experience like no other medium. What's more is the way they can work together to create truly spectacular scares. And I think the dollhouse in Resident Evil Village is a perfect example of this, both in the main game and in the DLC. It's certainly the most terrified I've been in a long time while playing a game. And I didn't even play the game! I'm still too chicken shit for that, but I was scared while watching others play it. But the way that these disparate elements come together and inform each other speaks to not just how good the horror is, but how good the game is. And that is why Resident Evil 8, or Village, or whatever it's called, and its DLC, had one of the scariest sections in recent video game memory. Here are my stray thoughts. Despite how good the original Dollhouse was, I was a bigger fan of the section in the DLC. That being said, I think my favorite is either the remake of Resident Evil 4 or the remake of Resident Evil 2, although I have fond memories of my brother playing the remake of 1. If you wanted to hear me talk about any of the other games in the main line, that might still happen. It's a big franchise, so who knows. But don't get your hopes up for 5. Happy Spooktober, everyone. Hey, thanks so much for watching that episode. I didn't really get a chance to talk about Cristina Pinedo, who's a horror scholar who talks about movies. I would have liked to have applied some of her thoughts to video games, but I already talked about her last year on the episode I did on Coraline, so you can go and check that one out. And if you like this one or that one, feel free to subscribe so you'll never miss another episode I've got going on right here on Cinemasters Ultimate Timeline.